Groot, aho. I've got the same problem as Saeed. You probably can't see me when I stand behind here, but I am one of those people that likes to see my thoughts laid out in front of me, so I do have notes. I promise I won't spend the whole time reading, but I probably will be located mostly behind here, trying to skip around. Where's that remote? Oh, yeah. Okay, so whenever I sort of do a general talk or to a new audience who maybe is not familiar with me, i.e. students who are tired of listening to me, and now it's going to get all loud. I like to put up this image first. I'm a really big fan of street art and the use of innovative visual methods in research, and I put up this particular image because it seems to capture how images of social issues and groups both reflect and shape how society makes sense of and responds to these particular issues. Or in this case, the media has a history of imaging street homelessness, and homelessness occurs across a spectrum, but I'm talking specifically about street homelessness in a really negative and punitive manner while responding accordingly in punitive ways. But this is one of my favourite images from Meek, the Australian political street artist activist, and in many ways I think graffiti and homelessness evoke similar local and policy responses. Both are seen to be polluting our streets and are actively removed or eradicated as a result. Think about every World Cup or sort of big sporting event that happens. No doubt every local council will actively work to remove homeless people so that our precious tourists don't have to trip over people in cardboard boxes. So homelessness, just like graffiti, can become a part of the normative background, and we can find ourselves walking past another human being as if they were just a scrap of graffiti on the wall. But images like this, I think, are harder to walk past. They can be a powerful platform for raising social consciousness, or raising the public and social consciousness. And in this instance, street artists don't necessarily aspire to change the definition of an artwork, but rather to question the existing environment with its own language. This is what street homelessness does. Okay, so this talk is really the culmination of the work I have been a part of as a team of researchers, firstly. So the Indigenous focus, or the Maori focus on homelessness, grew out of and extends from my PhD, or my time as a PhD candidate, and the thesis that I produced as a result of that, and it's extended into a much more systemic engagement. So I'm also the co-chair of the Maori caucus for the New Zealand Coalition to End Homelessness. It's similar to how I came to be in that position. It's similar to how I came into this talk, and I stepped into the shoes of people much more eminent and senior to myself, but at their behest. Not the other way around. So I'll skip. Won't. Black page. So homelessness has been a feature of urban life in New Zealand for over a century, longer really. If we're just talking about post-contact, then it's been a feature of urban life in New Zealand for over a century, and it's often portrayed through images of older men drinking in parks, bag ladies going through rubbish bins, street kids committing crimes, sniffing glue, and beggars harassing passers-by for money. And I'm not saying that this isn't part of the reality, but such public images are partial, and they tell us very little of the lived experiences of street homelessness for Māori people. If to be Māori is to have a tūranga waiwai, how can we be homeless in our own land? Does anyone know what this is an image of? Darren, you can't answer, but does anyone else have an idea? Yeah, workhouse, aye. So this is an image of an English workhouse system which started in the medieval period, and it was an attempt to address the labour shortage, let's put it that way, caused by the Black Death by restricting the movement of the poor. And it was based on that Christian philosophy of idle hands are the devil's plaything. So poor people and families, and this includes tamariki, disabled and elderly people, vagrants or homeless people, and the like, were housed here and given a set amount of work with no pay and under extremely poor conditions. No surprise, the sickness and mortality rates were pretty horrific. And something you might not know is that Charlie Chaplin was a survivor of the workhouses as a child. And in this particular image, they're being chained up in horse stalls and a plaiting rope and then unplaiting it, plaiting, unplaiting, all day, every day. Idle hands are the devil's plaything. So this is one way in which we used to punish the poor and homeless. And this system of understanding poverty is what the settlers brought with them. What the settlers brought with them alongside a rigid and brutal understanding of gender and sexuality, the role of children, te mea te mea. So these understandings still permeate today. So this is something that's popping up all in various cities in China, the US, the UK. This is referred to as hostile architecture. So these spikes are being put up. They're installed to prevent people from sleeping or sitting. So many cities have invested in these homeless torture infrastructures, I prefer to call them, spending thousands to install obstacles that will prevent homeless people from sleeping, standing, sitting in parks, under bridges, and next to public transportation. What kind of society do we live in when we respond to homelessness with spikes? Doesn't feel that much different from a workhouse environment. And interestingly enough, in London there was a massive controversy. There's been controversy everywhere they've sprung up. And in London, they had erected these spikes underneath, in the doorsteps and underneath the windowsills at the women's refuge. And so activists at night were at the women's refuge, for God's sakes. And so activists were sneaking out at night and pouring concrete over the spikes. And so they've been eventually pulled down from particular places, which is cool to see. This is a common public image of an older homeless man drunk on a park bench with the obligatory pool of urine. And the top three pictures that I've showed you are an example of how those range of options for addressing homelessness as a social issue are restrained by a really narrow public dialogue or conversation via the media. But these images are partial, and what we don't typically see, because of ethics I've had to use this horrible black strip, but what we don't typically see are images are like this, of these bottom two. So what we did in our research is that in our initial engagements and many of those extensions that we've gone on to do is we'd give homeless people cameras, we'd ask them to image their lives. So the purpose of doing that is to open up a conversation, because too often pronouncements are made about the poor, the homeless, as this unidentifiable blob, with no reference to their own understandings and strengths. And you can design all the programs in the world, all the pretty models in the world, but if you don't understand the issue, you will never resolve it. So these particular images were taken by Aria, who is a woman in her early 50s who strongly identifies as Maori. Throughout those initial engagements with her, she'd reflect on her childhood, immersed in the teachings of her queer and ahunga tikanga, and particularly Rongoa. And to escape the abuse that she was suffering from other family members, she took to the streets of Wellington at the age of 12. Her family would attempt to bring her back home, but when the abuse continued, she'd retreat back to the streets. And so by the age of 17, Aria had made the streets of Auckland her home and the homeless people that occupied the street her whānau. And throughout our interviews, as a woman growing up on and off the street, she'd come off for a bit, she'd come back, as most homeless people do, many do, I mean. She'd talk about the struggles with the pain of a childhood of abuse, not just for herself, but for her siblings, cousins, well, that's a busy phone, and the generations that followed. So 3 generations of her whānau are currently living on the streets of Auckland, far from their haukainga and the whānau they fear. But the young woman in the picture on your right, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And this is a controversial diagnosis, even in my home discipline of psychology. It's often misconstrues the emphasis and value that Maori place on our spiritual connectedness and our ongoing kōrero with our tūpuna. So the young people spoke about her diagnosis from a perspective te ao Māori. So she referred to herself, they referred to her what she experiences as the experiences of a matakete. So such people we know are held in awe for their capacity to connect the everyday and the ordinary with the sacred or otherworldly. And what she wanted to image in this particular picture, this young woman, she wanted Aria to take an image of herself wearing her tonga. It's probably a little bit too small, but there's a little white speck there, which you probably can't see, that she'd just recently been gifted by one of her family members that she still does keep in contact with, intermittently. And she wanted to show her relationship with her tāne, who is an immense source of support for her, and her joy, which has been expressed through her dazzling smile. So she'd approach Aria to help her remove the tapu that was causing reverberations with her sense of being matakete, and to return it to a protective state of safety or no. And in short, a childhood that's been steeped in ahunga tikanga has made Aria an invaluable member of the street Māori community, as she can act as a conduit that's connecting others to their wairoatanga and therefore strengthening whanaungatanga. And the image of the older guy in the back of a workshop, which used to be at Lifewise, holding the carvings, which he'd learned how to do in prison. Likewise, she blesses those, and they're then gifted to staff who leave, or to streeties who go on to get housing. So we don't often see these images of homeless people and the community that is bound together. But it's really important to realise that diversity of the homeless population, otherwise we risk dehumanising homeless people by reducing their lives to the problems they face without reference to their own strengths and understandings. And Saeed raised a really good point in his talk in looking at the restrictive nature of the conversation that's occurring around suicide in New Zealand. New Zealand is one of the most restrictive countries in the world when it comes to media coverage of suicide. And I understand that this is out of fear that one spark will ignite a fire that will increase suicidality. And let's face it, our media is increasingly, well, we don't really have independent media anymore. Goodbye, John Campbell. But the danger of a restricted conversation is silence and isolation, to quote Te Pai and Trish from yesterday morning. And as Saeed noted, and in silence and isolation, we die. So a ban on media, we're restricted in the ways that we can tell our stories, share our experiences, heal from our stories, connect with one another. And as Mike King mentioned, you can't educate people without it. You need that conversation. Suicide, much like homelessness, is treated as a contagion, a medical infection located within the individual that must be cured. I loved what Kate Goodwood with Lifeline said yesterday morning about the importance of communicating without judgment. Why are so many homeless, Māori homeless? Well, we've noticed from a lot. So I'm going to talk a bit about my work that responds to the lack of research on Indigenous homelessness, despite the representation of Indigenous people in homeless populations. All across the world, you can see this in any colonial setting. Indigenous people tend to be overrepresented. And the responses are lacking in input of Indigenous worldviews, histories and circumstances. Australian Indigenous psychologies talk about this as spiritual homelessness, where we have been displaced, dislocated from our ancestral lands. Some have been dislocated and displaced from those knowledges, the rituals and the kinship relationships that go with that. And that sense of spiritual homelessness is something Indigenous people all over the world can identify with. And what do we know about homeless people? They're 34 times more likely to commit suicide, 25 times more likely to die, and 150 times more likely to be assaulted fatally. This is the international picture. This is what it looks like internationally as well as here. Indigenous peoples within those already horrible statistics is Indigenous people die 7 years younger than members of settler populations, and are much more likely to live in poverty and experience homelessness. And if you divide that by gender, it starts looking a lot worse, particularly for tāne. And what we know here from the limited amount of research that there is, well, it's growing, the research in the area of New Zealand homelessness or Māori homelessness, and we don't have recognition from central government, so there's no way to resource or have a collaborative approach to homelessness, well, it makes it significantly difficult. But we do know from local street counts in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, places that are doing their own street counts, that Māori and Pacifica are overrepresented in the homeless population. In general, sometimes I'll start with a question. I ask people if they've ever met someone who's homeless, what do they think homeless people do? Who do they think? How do people think they came to be here? Quite often, people talk about homelessness as a choice, which is an interesting way to put it, versus a lack of options, which we tend to go along with. The US literature, the US scene, which tends to inform a lot of our policies and tends to inform a lot of the international picture, it talks about it from a very individualistic approach. So it talks about relationship breakdowns, family abuse, substance misuse, mental illness, deinstitutionalisation, whereas the UK literature and Indigenous literature, they tend to talk about those structural pathways into homelessness. So colonialism, socioeconomic inequities or poverty, ideology of individual responsibility. So this emphasis that it's the individual, they just need to harden up, pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And the short of it is it's a complex interweaving of both. So pathways in and the pathways out of homelessness are just as complex and multifaceted. So, as I said earlier, this is the culmination of a number of research projects, or our research as a team, and this is actually what my tāne's been involved in. So what we've looked at is that Māori homelessness is clearly linked to colonialism. It's occurred at a national level, it's occurred at an iwi level, it's occurred at a hapu level, and it's playing out at the personal level in our everyday lives. It's structural and is exacerbated by personal vulnerabilities that come with things like poverty. But this is a gardening project Matane been involved in with some of our other colleagues who have been working in this area, and this research explores the involvement of a group of older homeless men, Māori homeless men, who've been working in the gardens at Orake Marae on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And this isn't necessarily their marae of the homeless participants, but it is a culturally familiar space, and I'll talk about it a little bit, why it's difficult for them to return to their own pa. But needless to say, marae remains central to the reproduction of those relationships that occur at a marae and just ways of being Māori. Also a nice way to get out of that institutional space of service providers that they typically rely on for it as a space for care. This is what Bastion Point looks like now, or Takaparawhai. So the open green space in the foreground of that photograph is where where the gardening project is set up. This is something Orake, or Ngati Whatua Orake, has been doing alongside the Auckland City Mission, bringing homeless men in to reconnect with Papatuanuku. And it stands as an oasis, really, within the Auckland harbour, as most of the land in the area has been subdivided and developed, as you can see, by that congested mess. And there's always, of course, the neighbouring people complaining, why don't they develop that land? Please don't. Anyone know what this is? We would have tripped up on a few just getting here. Sorry? Souvenir shop? I don't know if that's what you guys see, but that's what it is. So this is a souvenir shop. This picture was taken by two young girls, twin sisters. They were 17 years old when I first met them. They'd been removed by SIFs as infants and then unceremoniously dumped by SIFs at the age of 17. I mean, you can't even hold a tenancy at 17 years old. You need a caregiver's approval to access WINS. You can't even legally vote. But nonetheless, they found themselves, they were too afraid to make them try and contact their whānau or to try and re-establish those links. And they're kids, they're 17. They did used to have a link with their nanny, but she passed away by the time they were 17 and dumped by WINS. So they were finding themselves sleeping under bridges in Auckland, engaging in sex work up on K Road or Karangahape Road. And when I first approached them, if they wanted to take part in this research project, they didn't really know what they were going to take photos of, and they were worried that they wouldn't have anything worthwhile to say. And they took a bunch of photos of Auckland City, showing the way in which, even within their young, short time, they've watched Auckland just grow into this strange collection of metal and windows and glass and traffic. And they took lots of images of souvenir shops. And the souvenir shop for these two young girls was a place they often returned to alleviate those feelings of moke or loneliness, for the home and the cultural relationships that give life and meaning to these places that they've never had, and is crystallised around such objects. And their profound sense of whakamā, of shame and humiliation, is captured in these images, and that they cannot and do not know how to find a point of cultural connection other than through a souvenir shop full of objects that are not intended for them, which they can't afford and which they can't store. So that loss of whanaungatanga and wairoatanga is keenly felt and experienced as a type of spiritual homelessness. And home is not realised without these. And I was bugging the kids yesterday as they were roaming around teaching us how to weave puti puti, because there was a particular whakatauki I was trying to remember, and I managed to track it down, you'll be pleased to know. But for me, this sort of summarises that whakatauki: he koko ngā whare ka kitea, he koko ngā kau e kore e kitea. All the corners of a room may be seen, not so the recesses of your heart. So homelessness is more than just a lack of physical shelter or a bricks and mortar issue. Housing is definitely a key component to resolving the issue of homelessness, but what about a whare for your wairua? So Maori cultural concepts in this sense, tikanga, ahunga tikanga, kawa, whānau whenua, are crucial for understanding Maori homeless people's relationships and efforts to cultivate a positive sense of self and place based on their identity as Maori. And this can contribute to an interpretation far more relative, foundational to their lived reality than is currently being offered in responses to homelessness. The vast majority of service providers and people that are looking after our whānau who are on the street are not Māori themselves. It's not to say they're not important allies, but their approaches need to be informed by our understandings. So we need to weave those multicultural perspectives through any response strategy, because it will impact Māori. Any response strategy is going to have a unique impact on Māori. So we need to provide a bridge between those past and current contexts of homelessness and a future ideal state where homelessness doesn't exist. So you're not really just looking at two young girls, you're looking at the legacy of colonisation, that legacy of displacement, dislocation, being played out at this very personal level. And if you don't do that, you depoliticise and individualise homelessness. And it's an issue for Māori because we've been rendered economically vulnerable. Whole communities have been rendered homeless in many ways through the processes of colonisation, and any attempt to gain economic independence has quickly been crushed, which has prevented our economic basis from developing, and as a result, we are more economically vulnerable. Sometimes it can be, every now and then I'll be asked by Māori TV or just be asked in general about Māori homelessness, and it's been difficult. That idea to be Māori is to have a tūranga waiwai, it's this tyranny of stability in some ways. We talk about Māori as if they were fixed in place, but ours is a history of human movement and displacement and forced movement. And what we see is that Māori are diverse people, and I think that's really come through in a lot of the talks here, the diversity of ways of being Māori, engaging in Te Ao Māori. But Māori are diverse, and colonisation has meant that for some, such as those two young girls, they're alienated from their tangata Māori and their communities. Their deep sense of loneliness, heartache, spiritual dislocation plays out. So for Aria, who I was talking about, who was taking those pictures, she grew up with her grandmother. She's grounded in all things Māori. She's an important resource for the street the Maori street homeless community. Go past that. So this is Phil. Met him in Hamilton. He's been homeless since he was about 14 years old. He would talk about as a kid he would escape from, he was removed from his whānau at 14, and he'd continue to try and escape the foster homes and SIFS care and get back to his whānau. And at one point they'd put him in a house, they put him within a home that was just around the corner from his whānau, where his whānau lived. And every day when he went to school he'd be expected to walk past them and have no contact with them. What would that do to a person? He's now in his 40s, and when we first met him through the process of research, he brought in a book that he'd borrowed from the library on his iwi history. So he presented himself immediately in this very culturally patterned manner. And as he was flicking through the pages of the book, he'd be recounting the walks that he'd taken with his whānau, be pointing out the different places he'd travelled as a child, or that's my tupuna, in a very distant relation to it. The idea of ahi ka is something that's lived and not experienced vicariously, so he's looking back through the eyes of a child and using this book to do so. Don't know how well you can see that, but what he's saying in this quote is an excerpt from the interview, and he's pointing out the little bits and the pictures in the books and connecting us, the researcher, with that. So that's who we are, that's my great-grandmother, that's my marae, all the bush up through the valley, and these are our chiefs, that's our river right there. I can't face them down there until I do all this stuff first. I should have done this stuff a long time ago. I go to the library and I read. We've got it pretty easy here. I can't believe why we have to be homeless when there's places for us to go to. Ask your family first, and ask where you're from, and what's your heritage, who you are, what's the meaning of your whare, your marae, how does that connect to your tribe. And I do that when I go to the library, I research. The irony is, at the time, the Hamilton City Council was trying to remove or ban homeless people from the library because, I don't know, just the one latest campaign they were on, there'd been some accidents some violent incidents that occurred just in the general area, not the library itself. And of course, who do we blame but homeless people, who are actually more often than not the victims of crime than the perpetrators of crime. And it got thrown out, luckily. But what he's actually saying here, it's a double-edged sword for him. While he feels a deep sense of whakamā that he hasn't been able to return home, he hasn't been able to, he was removed, and this theme of removal goes through most homeless people's stories, whether Māori, whether they're Pākehā, whether Pacifica, whether they're Asian, it goes through all their stories, experiences of institutionalisation. And I like what really reverberated with me what Moana Jackson was saying this morning about institutionalisation of hopelessness. So on the one hand, why he's insisting that we go out and we find out and that we don't let things slide like he did, the same opportunity he didn't have, at the same time he didn't exactly have an easy opportunity and an easy way to reconnect with his whānau. He's been forcibly dislocated. So clearly in his talk, and there's these tensions between the shame of being removed from childhood, his childhood home, his hokainga, and wanting to reconnect back with his hokainga. So the book in this sense represents a physical embodiment. It serves just the same purpose as any other taonga, of bridging that divide, of reconnecting, and it has to invoke aspects of forgetting in order to contend with that profound sense of whakamā, or shame and humiliation. He feels that being separated from his family and hokainga. And whakamā has always been a tool of social control, as powerful, if not more so, than forms of physical punishment. I think this has clearly come through in a lot of the talk around stigma that's associated with talking about suicide. And before colonisation, before pre-contact, It was the most effective. It was a rare tool to use of social punishment, but exclusion through homelessness did occur, but it was very, very rare, and there was nothing more horrible than that for a person. In a sense, it's being almost stripped of your whakapapa. And it still is for Māori, for all groups, anyone who is homeless, it is still a powerful tool of social control or of social punishment. So whakamā is associated with those traditional banishment practices, and homelessness today is, while it takes on a different form, the pathways out are quite different. It still has that same social punishment aspect. So spiritual homelessness occurs when one is separated from their ancestral, their hokainga, their whānau, and their whanaunga. So the service, I've already kind of mentioned that I'm the co-chair for the Māori caucus of the New Zealand Coalition to End Homelessness. So this is a voluntary group of members who are key stakeholders, you could say, in the area of homelessness. So they're service providers, academics like myself, and they work with a bunch of services as well, and council members as well. Some local councils like Auckland and Wellington sit on it. And the idea is that with the lack of central government recognition of homelessness, our housing minister was already denied that there's a homelessness issue. Overcrowding is fine. So housing affordability, of course, is not an issue as well, we've just recently heard. So in light of that, what we're trying to do is coordinate with no resourcing, no funding, coordinate responses so that we can protect those who are finding themselves homeless. I did like what Syed said, that in the absence of key players being behind you, flax roots do have to take over. But you do this within a really constrained environment. So there's a lot of services out there that do cater to our homeless whānau in some way or form, from soup kitchens to night shelters to food banks to clothing shops or second-hand stores, all sorts that work with homeless people in some capacity. And the reason, and some of the rhetoric you hear why we don't need to get behind the issue of homelessness is because, well, there's already this stuff out there, beggars can't be choosers, you should just be happy with that. How dare you ask for more? But these are the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. They're important, they're crucial, but they're the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. It's a band-aid solution. And it's tolerated politically, it's politically sanctioned, but it's not enough. And most service providers know this. They know they're caught in a double bind. They know it's a double-edged sword. They know that while they are doing something that's crucial, feeding someone is it's life-saving. But you're not going to address the structural issues of homelessness. You're not going to end homelessness through soup kitchens or night shelters. So the focus as well on housing just isn't enough. There's a popular theory of housing first, and like Mike King said, anything first is important, even if that is a night shelter or a soup kitchen. But we do need more as well. Putting someone in a house, relocating them from the street and putting them in the house isn't going to address those root causes that led them to homelessness in the first place. It's not going to keep them there. And in fact, many of the experiences of being behind four walls have been one of fear, abuse. It doesn't necessarily. House versus home. One represents physical shelter, the other's talking much more about the relationships, a centre of stability, everything that goes into what makes something a home. So a lot of from our research, what we've done is we've done a lot of workshops with service providers to translate our research into action, and these aren't perfect, they're evolving into forums for participation. So some of what the outcomes has been is more cultural input into the services that are being run. So to Aria is being rehoused. The two girls are still on and off the streets. Phil has been rehoused. And housing isn't, like I've already said, isn't necessarily the end goal. Fostering whare for your wairoa is just as equally important, but finding ways in order to reconnect and have those conversations. Been trying to, and this is part of the responsibility of us as the Māori caucus, is reaching out and talking to people about it, our people about it. And also the importance of being in conversation with agencies. You can't just randomly approach some person on the street who you figure looks sort of rough, maybe they're homeless. It's not safe for them, and it's not good for yourself to be doing that, so we do tend to work alongside in the same sense. The systemic engagements. Is it already at that? Oh my god, that does speed. Skip. Okay. So I'll quickly just get through these last two slides, maybe more. Research suggests that about 1/3 to 50% of homeless people have severe mental illnesses. What we did is we explored, as another aspect in our research, is that we explored the experiences of 6 Māori homeless people engaging with mental health services and the efforts of 6 practitioners to respond to their needs. So research suggests these pretty scary numbers. It's really, really hard to pin down. It's incredibly easy to pathologise homeless people, and I don't really like to talk about mental health issues as associated with homeless people. We know that psychiatric admission rates for Māori are approximately about 40% higher than all other ethnic groups combined, and this is exacerbated by poor living conditions, economic struggles, stress, stigma, social exclusion that's associated with homelessness. So our homeless participants, because of those negative experiences of institutionalisation, they've been scared and scarred by behavioural-orientated, data-driven service and are unwilling to submit themselves to it. And people, one of the most common questions I ever get is they always ask about the prevalence of mental illness amongst the homeless. And it'll be very, very easy to pathologise homeless people, and I don't often talk about mental illness and homelessness because I want them to see their people first and to understand the context rather than a disorder. And the importance of humanistic and culturally informed approaches emphasises that human connection, compassion, dignity and responsiveness. Skip. So, not sure if you can read that. This is Arona, a 39-year-old Māori woman who was 7 years old when she was diagnosed with a mental illness, or I love how Kate Goodwood puts it, a superpower. But she describes herself as a mental health survivor. When I was young, my mum passed away, so my dad was left with a lot of children. It was hard with my father, he was an alcoholic, it was rough. I used to hide and try to become invisible, so he used to give me a hiding quite a lot. So I ended up building a wall around me. I became like one of those kids that like to be by themselves. I used this to wrap myself in our old carpet at the back of the house so I could be invisible, so my dad wouldn't find me. How I encountered my first experience of mental health was when I hung my nephew in the garage. I was about 7. We were playing, I was angry with him because he kept crying and I was afraid I'd get a hiding, so I hung him in the garage. He didn't die, but that was when I found out I had a mental illness and that it wasn't a natural thing for a kid to do. Social welfare came to get me and they locked me up. Clearly, by calling herself a mental health survivor, her experiences of dealing with institutions has been predominantly negative. And building a wall around herself and wrapping herself in a carpet to become invisible, it's that aching for physical connection. Last slide. You know when the kids come out that it's getting serious. Okay. So, the first thing I'm ever asked, the first question I ever get that everyone asks, and it's the damn hardest question to answer, and over the years I've tried to answer it in a variety of ways, from nice little sound bites to long-winded intellectual discussions, and today I'm going to answer it from a position of honesty. Whenever someone asks me what can we do, the honest answer is I don't have all the answers. Nobody does. And I really liked what Monique had to say, that often people don't want to die. They want a better life, and this is clear from our Māori homeless whanaunga. And these overly individualistic approaches to care do not work and can be incredibly unsafe and damaging to people. It's about whānau, tikanga, kawa, and returning to our ways, but this has to be a total approach, all generations together. Today is about looking after your own. This has to change. I was recently asked to speak at an event, and I did it in a much less time, I promise. I was asked to speak at Massey University's Maori graduation, and I was trying to think what to say, and then I knew without a doubt some fucking tool would get up and without a doubt would look at those young, excited faces, those rows of young, excited faces, clothed in their beautiful korowai of elaborate and illustrious designs, and would remind them of how Māori are over-incarcerated, undereducated, over-drinking, over-drugging, dying, etc. And I knew, and without a doubt, somebody did get up and do that. So I tried to follow by saying, you're not the exception, you are exceptional, but you're not the exception, you're the rule. And what I have tried to show through this talk is just to look at the strategies of resilience that people that are homeless, that we would think of a situation of absolute hopelessness, the strategies they try to employ to maintain their identity, maintain a sense of belonging, and maintain a sense of self. I don't even really remember much of my own graduation. It passed in a blur of goofy hats and weird robes. But I do remember my mum, my tāne, and my koro smiling back at me. Kia ora koutou, I will get off the damn stage.